Good afternoon. I knew there was community interest, but I didn't anticipate standing room only on the first task force meeting. But welcome all to the Cultural and Entertainment Capital Needs Task Force meeting. My name is Chuck Harvey. I'm one of the co-chairs of the task force, and I'm joined with John Daniels from Quarles and Brady, who you'll hear from shortly, and also Jay Williams, who you'll also hear from shortly, the other two co-chairs. We're delighted to see the turnout and to see the interest that this task force has generated. One of the things that when the co-chairs, we had a chance to have, our own discussions, both individually and collectively, to talk about what we wanted to try and accomplish. We really settled on two things that we really committed to trying to do. First, we would have we would generate a fact-based, inclusive discussion regarding some of our key cultural and entertainment assets, specifically focusing on the capital needs side of it. We also wanted to make sure that we provide the community with viable options for funding these institutions, and also we want to make sure that there's a dialogue around this, because at the end of the day we really believe fundamentally that holding on to these institutions matter. And so as we talked about this, the idea is that it would be a year-long conversation, and one part of the conversation has already been bandied around quite a bit, and that is regarding the BMO Harris Bradley Center. That and its future. It's already a hot topic. But as the co-chairs and I discussed this, and as others have discussed this, the conversation, frankly, needs to be bigger than that. So what we've tried to do here is to make sure that we have the right voices, a broad selection of voices from across the community to participate in this vital conversation. But really, if you think about this task force, and those of you who certainly have an interest in where we come out, it's really up to us to really shape the discussion, this task force task, if you will. It's to steer the conversation, over the coming months in a way that it is really fact-based, it's less anecdotal and someone's opinion, but that it really resonates in a way that the community can make a decision based off of the best information, based off of best practice knowledge and the like. But we got started with the MMAC, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Association of Commerce. They really provided the spark to kind of get this conversation started. And so the co-chairs felt it was important that Tim Sheehy share some of the perspectives around this conversation. So I would ask Tim, why don't you come up and sort of share with them what you shared with us.
Sure. This is the first time, and I think the last time I'll address the group. I plan to fade back to my seat and be one of the task force members after this. But as the co-chairs talked about this, we thought it was appropriate at least to step up front here to start and really answer the question, why did we convene this group? And while we talk about that, I want to extend my sincere thanks both to all the three co-chairs and everybody around here. I've talked to everybody almost individually, and if I haven't, over the phone, or we've exchanged emails. And I fully realize that you have full-time day jobs, and that your commitment here is because you care about this community and you want to see things happen in this community. So I just want to thank you, and I respect and appreciate the fact that you've taken the time out to do this. We're going to hear a lot over the next year on this task force, and clearly Milwaukee has its challenges, and we recognize that. Poverty is too prevalent, educational attainment is too lacking, and job growth is too slow. This task force will not solve all those problems, but we're all sitting here with a recognition that those issues are in and around the task force. But I don't want to just dwell on our challenges. I also think this task force wants to look ahead at some of our opportunities. We have committed in giving citizens. We've got a strong, diversified economy, and we have an enviable quality of place. And that really brings the point to the discussion that we're going to have over the next year on this task force. When we talk about quality of place, in this instance, we're talking about the public investments that are being made in our cultural and entertainment venues. And again, from our perspective, which is only one perspective on this task force, that those investments make this region a more attractive place to live. They make it a more attractive place to work, and certainly they make it a more attractive place to play. So to get down to why we're doing this, we're sponsoring the task force because we do not see a strategy going forward that will sustain these cultural and entertainment assets as we look ahead. Clearly, as Chuck mentioned, there's a running debate, at least in the press, over the value and importance of the BMO Harris Bradley Center. But as we get into this, you're going to hear, I think, and Rob Henkin, when you hear from him, there's more of a quiet crisis when it comes to some of our other cultural and entertainment institutions in this community that are publicly financed. So our goal is a strategy to support our cultural and entertainment assets, to put these issues on the table, to have an informed, thoughtful discussion, and to make some recommendations. We've been put into this position, MMAC, by our membership. They do not want to see the future of our cultural and entertainment institutions left to chance. They don't want to see this left to indecision, and they certainly don't want to see us make a generational mistake. And so on the other side of this, if we envision a future where there are less of these assets or fewer of these assets, then let's do so with a forethought of what that would mean to this community. The context for the business community is that metropolitan Milwaukee is in a vibrant competition, and we think it's a global competition for jobs and the capital investment that comes with those jobs, and that there's a clear link between quality of place and our ability to grow, retain, and attract the talent that we're going to need. Rob's got a lot of slides. I only have a couple, so don't worry here. And I don't take my word for it. I kind of turn to the largest global employer that's headquartered here in the region. That's Manpower. And Jeff Joris has, I think, a very pithy way to put this, that economies are going to compete and survive based mainly on talent, which says to me that Milwaukee is going to do the same, that we're going to compete, and our stickiness, our ability to attract and retain talent is going to be an important driver of our success. And if you think about Jeff's statement, think about it in the context of this. Everybody is interested in more jobs. When you look out and we project between today and 2020, how many more jobs there are going to be in this community, and if we got this right, we should be employed in some other line of work, but it's our projection about what's going to happen. There are going to be about 7% more jobs in 2020 than there are today, basically through modest economic growth, and we hope that picks up, but due to the demographic changes that are coming to retirement. When we look at that number, 7% means that we're going to have 63,000 more jobs in 2020 than we do today. When I look at the other trajectory on the screen, which tells you the growth in our working age population, and I'm going to be a little bit generous here, if you look at the working age population in 2020, between the ages of 15 and 69, okay, there are going to be a whopping 13,000 more people age 15 to 69 in, quote, the workforce in 2020, 13,000 more than there are today, on a base of 1.45 million. So clearly we are going to have a challenge making sure that we educate more kids, that we broaden the workforce, and that we recruit and attract people here, or we are not going to make those two numbers work. And I think there's a critical link between our job strategy and the work of this task force, which is focused on what makes this region unique and distinct. And while I'm on the point about being unique and distinct, we've purposely drawn from the region because one of the great strengths we have here in Milwaukee is, whether it's Ozaukee, Waukesha, or Washington, or the city of Milwaukee, we have, we believe, very unique assets that make this an attractive place to create jobs. But our economy is united by, or our community is united by our economy. And if you look at the work patterns, you're going to see that this is one functional economy. This slide shows you that only in Milwaukee County do a majority of the people live in Milwaukee County and work in Milwaukee County. The entire region, the majority of the workforce is leaving the county it lives in and working in another county. So we have an economy that is truly regional. I think it's truly global, and it functions that way. So I don't think we should be making decisions based on how long it took a horse to ride in a day from county seat to county boundary. We ought to be thinking about how we tackle these issues as a region. The last point I want to make is, and there's been a lot of discussion about this, and it's one of the reasons we pulled this group together, is these assets that we're talking about, not all, but many of them reside in one county. That's a historical fact. But I just took this snapshot from some of the institutions in the room here and asked them the question, just not to pick on Ozaukee, but just to use this as an example, how many residents from Ozaukee County hold memberships in the zoo? How many attended the Art Museum last year? How many attended the Milwaukee Public Museum? How many went to the Performing Arts Center for an event? And how many attended at least one event in the Bradley Center? So not only do we work as a region, not only do we live as a region, but we play as a region. And that's why we think this is an important discussion for this task force. So again, if we work together, we play together, we live together, our hope is that we can act together, and our hope is that this task force is the first part of that discussion. And again, I'll conclude by thanking you all very much. I know you're all very busy, and this is really a community effort. So I'm going back to Jay. You bet.
Thanks, Tim. Our goal is to facilitate a fact-based discussion. Good people can differ on the best solution, but we should at least be advocating positions and making decisions based on good information. We'll start by looking at Milwaukee County facilities. We're guessing the task force would also like to look at data from other counties in our metro area, and we would need to gather that information. This is a very complex regional issue. We'll look at approaches several other metropolitan communities have used as a way to address their capital needs. We'll talk about continued public funding of these assets as it is appropriate and under what conditions. We'll also talk about funding approaches, and we'll explore approaches used by other communities that may work here. Those seem to Chuck and John and myself to be the obvious topics of the task force, but all the task force members will have a chance to influence the agenda as we go forward. That said, the task force does have a single purpose, and that's the capital needs of key cultural and entertainment facilities. This means we'll focus on the capital budgets and not operating budgets. It means we'll focus on just one of many challenges facing our community. We know that there are challenges, most notably around education and human services, that are gravely important to this area's long-term viability. We also know that there are many other initiatives focused on addressing those issues. We don't expect the result to be one point of view and one definitive recommendation, but we do expect to build a common understanding of the facts and options. We value your thoughts, and we will work hard to make sure we gather those thoughts. I'd like to turn over to John.
Boy, it's pretty warm out there today, isn't it? Well, welcome everybody, and thanks a lot for taking time to participate in this. Not only the task force members, but certainly all of the people and citizens who are out here today. This is a very important subject matter for our entire community. Really appreciate the opportunity for all of us to be engaged. As Chuck and Jay have said, we want to focus around this being an initiative that is based on assembling the facts and allowing the options to evolve. One of the things that I think is important, however, is that most of us know in life that there are sort of things that sort of touch us in a way that change the way we think and feel about our community. And I think all of the assets that we're talking about do just that. So I want to give you sort of a personal story that describes why I felt it was important to be a part of this initiative. About 35 years ago, Jay and I had small kids, and I remember one Memorial Day, we spent the time together with our families in the park, actually for several years. It illustrated to me sort of the wonderful benefit of our park system, but more importantly, what it illustrated to me was what the best things are that can happen in this community in terms of relationships, friendships, and making a community more livable and inclusive for everyone. So on a personal note, the ability to have things that drive those kinds of feelings about our community are really very, very important. I tried to get a loan from Jay that day, but he said my collateral wasn't strong enough. On a serious note, what I really would like to note for you is that this task force has a tremendous amount of talent. We want to utilize that talent in the most effective ways for our entire community. As was mentioned, you don't expect unanimity anytime you've got 48 very, very talented people any place. But I'm very confident that we can come up with a set of community options that will be first rate. And in that regard, what I'd like to note is that while we're assembled here today as a group, there will be multiple ways for us to be involved. And we really want people to be engaged so that it is a real dialogue. So we're working on ways to do that, to structure these meetings so that it does that, the use of the internet. We'll have small breakout groups. We'll have questionnaires which go out after the meeting. I guess the thing that we really want to reflect by Chuck and Jay and myself is that we want this process to be inclusive, and we want to make sure that every voice in the community actually gets heard. So thank you all on the task force, your participation, but also thank you for all the citizens who are involved in this initiative to move our community forward. Chuck?
Thanks, John. You know, as a task force member, I'm sure you want to know, so how are we going to get my questions answered, or how am I going to get my information vetted? So one of the things that we've done is we have a relationship with the Public Policy Forum, and their research capability is certainly at the disposal of the task force. And so let me start by introducing a couple of the Public Policy Forum folks. Let me first start with Ann Curley. Ann, you mind standing up? You'll see her thank you. You'll see her biographical information in the back of the directory, and she'll be working with us doing a lot of the research. You know, also I'd like to take a moment to introduce Rob Hankin, and you're going to hear from Rob in just a second. Rob, mind standing up? So you're going to hear from Rob in just a second. But, you know, Rob has been president of the Public Policy Forum since 2008. He's an excellent researcher, a great resource to have in the community. And I'll just highlight a couple of elements of his background. You'll also see the full write-up in the packets that's on the table there. But prior to becoming president of the Public, he worked in Milwaukee County government for nearly 10 years, serving as Director of Research for the County Board, Director of Health and Human Services, and Director of Administrative Services. He's also directed a couple of nonprofit organizations as well. In addition to leading the Public Policy Forum, He's also an associate professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Architecture and Urban Planning. And Rob has a degree in history from Brown University and a master's in journalism and public affairs from American University. He's married to Barry, and they have 2 sons. And so we're delighted. The co-chairs are particularly delighted, but I'm sure as task force members, you too will be delighted having this resource at our disposal. Rob is going to share some information with us that's been part of prepping for this task force. So Rob Hankin.
Well, good afternoon. First of all, Chuck, thank you, and thanks to all of you. It's really quite an opportunity to get to stand before such a distinguished group of community leaders who are interested in hearing about the Public Policy Forum's research. I do feel I need to clarify that the Public Policy Forum is not a formal member of this task force, nor is our research in any way, has the scope or the content been influenced in any manner by the members, the leaders of this task force. But again, we are delighted that the Chamber and this very distinguished group of individuals values the work that we've put into this topic, and we look forward to sharing it with you. My task this afternoon is a difficult one. For those of you who have noticed, we put out a 164-page report, went out on our website yesterday. So it is my responsibility to try to summarize those 164 pages in about 25 minutes or so. We want to make sure that there's plenty of time for questions and answers, and so I'm going to attempt to do that. For the members of the task force, we have printed out copies of the executive summary of the report, so you have those, but the full report is available on our website. Before I begin, I want to recognize 2 people in the audience, Vanessa Allen and Jeff Schmidt. Could you both stand up? Vanessa was actually the lead researcher on this project, so if you're angry about something in this report, talk to her after the meeting. Jeff, meanwhile, is the guy who made these 164 pages actually look good and appear readable. So both of them are here, and indeed, when we get to the questions, I may very well be leaning on them for a few answers. So let me get started now with the presentation. Another big thanks. Our research was commissioned by the Spirit of Milwaukee. Gary Grunow is the board chair for the Spirit, who's on the task force. So this project really emanated from the Spirit coming to the Public Policy Forum and saying, you know, we're about to have this very important community conversation, and it would be very good to get some facts on the table about the actual condition of these very important assets. The forum is no stranger to this topic. We actually put out a comprehensive report in 2002 regarding the condition of the county parks. We went out and actually surveyed and analyzed several parks within the Milwaukee County Park System, and I think this report is one of the reports, and I wasn't with the forum at the time, so I can say that this without trying to take any credit for it, but really helped escalate the conversation about the conditions of our parks and are we appropriately taking care of them. That was back in 2002. In 2008, for the Cultural Alliance of Milwaukee, we did a subsequent report where we did sort of a higher level look at just the county-owned cultural institutions in the parks, looking at fiscal trends and doing a preliminary evaluation of their fiscal condition. So what makes this report any different? Well, we really wanted to get at 3 main research questions for this endeavor. The first one is, how much public funding is needed? Now, that may seem like a very elementary question to you, but it concerned us that despite the fact that this discussion has been raging in our community really since the 1980s and 90s about what to do to properly take care of our parks and cultural institutions, there has been very little effort to really quantify what's needed. In 2008, as many of you may recall, there was actually a referendum question, a non-binding referendum in Milwaukee County that suggested a penny sales tax to address the needs of parks, cultural institutions, Milwaukee County Transit, emergency medical services. And not to disparage that effort at all, I think it was concerning that there was never an effort at that point to try to figure out how that penny, which would have raised about $130 million, how those funds would have been distributed among the various categories that I just mentioned, and even within the parks and the cultural institutions. Which parks and cultural institutions are we talking about? Are we talking about just the county-owned, or are we talking about the broad range? Are we talking about just operating assistance and getting this off the property tax, or are we talking about capital needs as well? So again, we felt that clearly there was a need for further evaluation of those questions going forward. Next question, and I just touched on it. Which institutions and how should the money be allocated? So again, as you're about to hear, in many other places across the country where there has been a decision to try to come up with a unique, specific, dedicated funding source for parks and cultural assets, there has also been inclusion of those that are not owned by public sector entities. The feeling has been this is about ensuring that there's the desired array of cultural opportunities available to citizens. And so again, we thought that we could contribute by at least giving some perspective on how other entities across the country had dealt with questions like this. Which leads to my third bullet. Again, how have other regions approached the problem? Not only who's going to be included and who's not, and how we're going to define the scope of any dedicated funding source should we decide to go in that direction, but how are we going to focus the funding? Again, operating versus capital. Are we looking at a time-limited initial burst of money that could take care of a finite set of major projects, or are we instead looking at some type of an ongoing funding support that's going to provide a steady stream of revenue to generally support operations and capital needs of these entities? So these are all very important nuances, and we knew that this community debate was going to happen, and we thought that hopefully we could ground that debate with some basic factual information. And we're all going to respond to those facts in different ways, but again, if we could lay these facts on the table, we thought that that would help contribute to a worthwhile debate. So the scope of our analysis, first and foremost, Milwaukee County-owned arts and cultural institutions and the Milwaukee County Parks. So if you look at the 164 pages, I don't have the number in front of me, but I would imagine 75 or 80 of those pages are devoted to the Milwaukee County-owned institutions. We, however, also wanted to at least get a flavor for how those organizations that were operating in their own buildings or in non-county owned buildings, how they were doing. How they were doing financially, what was the condition of their buildings, and should we, in fact, if indeed we're going to be thinking about some new way of funding these assets, should we be including the privately owned as well as the publicly owned? So we did not have the capacity to go out and analyze all 200 or so arts and cultural and entertainment organizations in the 7-county region, but we did decide to narrow in on 6 major ones. And the key criterion is that we wanted to look at those that either owned or soon aspired to own their own facilities, because a major emphasis of our research was comparing the operating versus the capital needs. Finally, the major sports and convention facilities. I have some slides on this in a second to further explain the reasons why, but look, we don't live in a vacuum, and we knew when the Spirit first approached us late last year that ultimately this discussion about the nature of our cultural and our cultural parks and arts assets was also going to involve entertainment assets and professional sports arenas. So we wanted to give a flavor to our readers. How do the finances and the business models of these entities compare to the other entities that we were going to be looking at? So we have a very broad level analysis, and we picked just the 3 biggest, the Wisconsin Center, Miller Park, and the BMO Harris Bradley Center. As you may be aware, there's also going to be a part 2. So a second report, which we will be working diligently to try to get out by the end of February, will actually look at 2 other aspects of this equation. First, we're going to explore the funding mechanisms used by 5 other metro areas. I'm not going to go into detail this afternoon as to why we chose these 5, but we think that they all have very important insights for Milwaukee, again, if indeed we're going to think about doing something here with a dedicated funding source. So in our next report, we'll have detailed analyses, not only about the composition, and actually in the report that we released yesterday, the back page does contain some basic elements of the funding mechanisms used by these 5 regions, but we'll get into governance structures. We'll get into what were the politics politics surrounding their decisions regarding who to include and who not to include. We'll get at the decision-making process in terms of the funding source. Is it a time-limited funding source that has to go back before the voters every 10 years or so, or is it something that just continues? So we'll get into all of those issues in the second report. Then, which I think you will find hopefully especially provocative, we'll model some approaches for Milwaukee County. This is not to say that the Public Policy Forum is saying we must come up with a new funding source, but it is to say, given that this task force is going to be thinking about this, given that others in the community are going to be thinking about this, we think we could help inform that conversation by actually modeling 4 different types of funding approaches and what those might look like here. So stay tuned for that report as well. Let me dive into this report now. And again, I'm going to go pretty quickly. The full report is available to all of you. We felt it was very important that before digging into the physical and financial condition of the Milwaukee County-owned arts and cultural institutions and parks, that we provide our overview with a very, our audience with a very broad overview of the county's finances. Even more challenging than drilling down our 164 pages into a 25-minute presentation is drilling down the county's finances into 8 or 9 pages, which is what we tried to do in this report. What we focused on were those elements of the county's financial condition that were most relevant to the discussion about how and to what extent the county was able to address the needs of its parks and its cultural facilities. So a couple key items stood out from this analysis. Number one, we have this dynamic where the growth in mandated costs faced by county government are outpacing the growth in intergovernmental revenues. Now, let me translate that into plain English, and let me tell you a story. Way back when counties were created, they were created to be arms of state government. And so the premise essentially was that state government believed that there were certain types of governmental functions that were better delivered on the local level. They created counties to essentially provide those functions. We're talking about sheriff's services and courts and judiciary, district attorney services, health and human services are some of the big ones. And the general premise was that the state government was going to create counties to administer and provide these services, but state funding was going to support these services. And this was, again, decades ago. There were also several federally mandated services that either were passed along from the state to counties or were directly passed from the federal government to counties. And again, a similar premise. There were going to be federal dollars behind these functions. What has happened over time is that the cost of administering and providing these functions has grown much more rapidly than the state and federal funding streams that were originally designed to support them. And so that's a problem. And is that a problem mainly because of the lack of commitment by the state and federal government? I'll leave that to you. There are other issues here. Clearly, one of the reasons that the costs of the county functions grew faster than the revenue streams were some particulars of Milwaukee County. Fringe benefits, as you all know, has been a major cost driver for county government. And so it's really a detailed and a nuanced story. But the relevance for this conversation with this task force is that on the other side of the ledger, we have the so-called discretionary county services. So over time, counties inherited, by their own choice and with the approval of state government, a series of additional services. Parks, cultural institutions, transit are perhaps the 3 largest. And the premise there was that the locally generated revenues, the local sales tax and the local property tax, were to support those discretionary services. What has happened as the cost pressures on the mandated services have exceeded the growth in the revenues is that a greater and greater amount of the locally generated revenues have had to be put into the mandated services, therefore leaving fewer resources available to take care of the discretionary functions like the parks and cultural institutions. I have a graph in just a second that's going to illustrate that. So that's one big part of the story. A second big part is what has happened on the capital side for county government. Back in 2003, the county made a decision, which in my own estimation, and I worked for the county at the time, was a good decision, to refinance a significant chunk of its long-term capital debt in order to A, take advantage of lower interest rates, and B, provide some relief in its operating budget. It was in the early 2000s when the cost pressures facing the county were first starting to get very fierce. And so what happened is that in making that decision to refinance and essentially push back debt payments for existing debt, the county was also faced with a dilemma, because if it continued to borrow at the $40 or $50 million a year clip that it had deemed appropriate to take care of its capital needs, then eventually there was going to be an explosion. There was going to be a big problem 6 to 10 to 12 years down the line. So the county made what was then a very prudent decision to say, look, we can't borrow. If we're going to refinance this debt and push back some of the payments, we can't borrow at the rate that we have traditionally borrowed. We're going to cap it at roughly $30 million per year. From a fiscal management perspective, I would submit to you that was exactly the right decision to make. The problem was that it didn't jive with the capital needs. So whereas $30 million or so a year, again, made sense from a financial perspective, it did not make sense when you took a look at the age of the county's infrastructure and the breadth of the county's infrastructure. And as a result, a lot of these needs were pushed back. And we'll get into that a little bit in just a moment. Final thing I just wanted to mention is we talk as a group about the county-owned institutions. There are two of them that actually function as county departments. So as I'm sure you're aware, the Public Museum, for example, and the Marcus Center, those are not county departments. They are administered by private nonprofit organizations. Their employees are not county employees. However, the Milwaukee County Parks and the Milwaukee County Zoo do function as county departments. And that's relevant because those two entities are more directly impacted by the problems the county has experienced in terms of the growth of its pension and retiree health care costs over the past decade. So I know a lot of information summarized on a couple slides. But let me just now show you, to amplify the first point that I made. This chart depicts the local revenue distribution. So the county has an annual budget of about $1.3 billion. Roughly $330 million of that is local sales and property tax revenue. And so this just shows you the local revenue distribution and amplifies the point I made earlier. Optimally, and the way this was supposed to all work, you would have had the vast majority of the locally generated revenues supporting the discretionary county functions. What we see on this chart is that courts and judiciary and prosecution and health and human services and the sheriff and debt service are the largest recipients of these local revenues. Only 9% of the county's locally generated revenues are being dedicated right now to its parks and culture function. Next, I want to dive in. I'm going to do this quickly, but I do want to give a brief review of the specific county-owned institutions that we looked at. I'm going to move through this quickly. First of all, just in terms of the combined size, if we look at the 2013 Milwaukee County budget, we see a total of about $63 million being dedicated to support parks and cultural institutions. We've divided it up on this slide by debt service support and operating support. So you see that for the Parks Department in 2013, about $24.5 million of levy going into operations, and about $17.6 million of local county revenue going to support debt on capital projects that have previously been financed by the county. For the cultural entities, that's $11.4 million and $9.3 million. So again, a total of about $63 million. Now when we look at them one by one, first of all, we are going to show you the annual budgets for each of these. There are numbers up here that show you the ratio of public funding to private funding to earned revenue. I'm not going to recite these numbers for you. I'm not going to go into them. But I think you're going to find them relevant as you move forward, because looking at the composition of these various revenue streams, as I'm about to tell you, does have a bearing on where their risks are, where their fiscal challenges are, and where their fiscal opportunities are as well. Broad overview of the Public Museum. I think most of you are familiar with the fact that there were some very, very serious problems in the middle of the last decade that essentially almost caused us to lose the museum. Those were addressed in a number of ways. Things were looking better for a little while, but then in 2012, the museum announced that once again, it was very concerned on over-reliance on traveling exhibits, some unsustainable pension costs that the museum was facing. Another set of very big operating challenges emerged for the Public Museum. The good news is that public museum leadership, county leadership, both from the board and the county executive, got together and forged an agreement. And I'm not going to tell you whether it was a good or a bad agreement, but from the perspective of the public museum, it has certainly provided for some greater operating budget stability, at least for the near future. Does that mean these problems have gone away? Absolutely not. But a very helpful payment that the county made to support the museum's pension obligations has helped, and so at least short term, the crisis has been averted. It's on the capital side where arguably there are very, very challenging problems for the museum. And I'm sure Jay Williams would say not arguably. As we looked at it and we tried to analyze the needs for the next 5 years, capital needs that have been identified by the museum and reported to the county, and for each entity, that's one barometer that we used. We also did some more digging and interviewing and added a few capital projects that we learned about. But in tallying this up for the public museum, about $27.7 million of capital repair needs identified for the next 5 years. And the county, as part of the commitment it made, has made a generous commitment of $1 million a year to support museum capital. But as you can see, there's a big gap between those two numbers. So not quite clear whether all of this work can get done, whether the private sector might be able to step in to fund some of this work, but clearly there's a needs gap there. Already, the museum has secured some private sector commitments for a few of its big projects. But again, I think a sort of an ongoing theme of our report is to what extent can entities like the public museum lean on private philanthropy to take care of capital needs? When you look at the combined needs of all of these organizations, you start to wonder about the capacity of our philanthropic community to support all of those needs. Broad overview of the Marcus Center for the Performing Arts. The Marcus Center has had to absorb some cuts in county support over the year. Back 5 to 10 years ago, public funding was probably closer to 30 to 35% of the Marcus Center's budget. It's now about 15%. To its credit, it has come up with ways to enhance earned revenues. It has made some structural changes in terms of its staffing and other efficiencies. And more or less, it's doing pretty well, okay, from pretty well right now from an operational perspective. Where the Marcus Center, too, however, is very challenged is in capital needs. And there's one big problem. We do see a discrepancy. I'll be talking about it a little bit more in a couple minutes, between sort of those entities that face the need for a couple of big major improvement projects versus those that just face dozens of smaller nuts and bolts infrastructure needs. In the case of the Marcus Center, while the Marcus Center does have some smaller nuts and bolts infrastructure needs, the big problem it's facing is its parking structure. The parking structure is deteriorating. Something needs to be done here. The question is whether would it be rebuilt as is, or, as I think Marcus Center officials would like to see, would it be an opportunity to expand the parking structure, add some other elements to it that have revenue-generating potential, so that they not only take care of the parking structure problem, but they also are able to boost some of their earned revenue capacity, which in fact could someday allow them to wean themselves from Milwaukee County support. But that's a big number. That number is $25 million. There's a plan in place. There is work being done to try to secure agreement from the various parties, but at this point in time, that has not yet happened. The War Memorial Center. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the condition of the War Memorial Center, the fact that this too, like the museum, sort of reached a crisis point actually earlier this year. And again, there was an effort by the county to negotiate with both the War Memorial Center officials and the Milwaukee Art Museum, which, as you know, is part of the same general complex. This new agreement for the War Memorial Center. Had I been presenting this data a year ago, I would have listed the War Memorial Center as #1 on the list for an entity that really needed some help on the operating side. For the most part, for now at least, that has been somewhat addressed by this agreement. One of the problems is, in this case, is that the county's agreement, while very generous, it's essentially guaranteeing flat funding for several years. Flat funding is better than declining funding, but the War Memorial Center has some limited potential right now to enhance earned revenue, so that's a potential longer-term issue. In terms of the capital plan, $25 million has been committed. That's $15 million from the Art Museum and $10 million from Milwaukee County. That should certainly address some of these immediate needs. Other piece of good news is that in addition to addressing some of the basic infrastructure needs, You know, for those of you who have walked into the building, there are puddles on the floor. There are real basic fundamental problems there. But this $25 million is not only going to take care of those, but it's also going to allow for some improvements and again, some extra revenue generating opportunities from some of the improvements that will be made. It is important to note, however, that there at one time was a series of improvements that the War Memorial Center wanted to pursue, a visitor education center, other enhanced amenities to try to get at this issue that they really don't have a lot of earned revenue potential. None of that is in this $25 million plan. Milwaukee Art Museum, again, part of the agreement with the War Memorial Center. The new agreement not only provided a boost in county funding, but also the Art Museum's funding, most of it was passed through from the county to the War Memorial Center to the Art Museum. The Art Museum will now be getting a direct allocation of money, which it believes will be very helpful because it will have more control over using the county funds to support what it considers to be its priority repair and maintenance needs. The capital plan that I just told you about, again, addresses major infrastructure needs for the Art Museum and also enhances some of its earned revenue possibilities. I think perhaps the one warning sign here is the extent to which the county's $10 million commitment here is going to impact its ability to commit capital funds for other needs at other buildings. We looked at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. Unfortunately, there's been some turnover in administrative staff there. We were not able to dig as deeply into the Historical Society. However, what we were able to review caused some concern. 2012, the Historical Society ran a sizable operating deficit, and so we think that this is one that certainly people are going to have to keep their eye on to the extent that, again, we want to make sure that we have a Milwaukee County Historical Society. On the capital side, you may be familiar with the renovation project that took place, was completed a couple years ago for the interior of the building. It was really a very nice example where the county and the Friends of the Historical Society got together and teamed up and made that project happen. So good news is the interior of the building is in good shape. Bad news is the exterior of the building now needs a lot of work, and it still has not yet been determined whether the same type of public-private model can be put into place to take care of that work. Milwaukee County also owns two smaller museums, the Charles Allis Art Museum on Prospect and the Villa Terrace overlooking the back Lincoln Memorial Drive. There we see two entities that are very reliant on county support, but have done a nice job increasing facility rentals and being able to offset some declines in county funding. On the capital side, while this number looks smaller than many of the numbers you'll see in our report, the Charles Allis and Villa Terrace museums do have some substantial capital needs, and so it sort of adds to the list of potential needs that Milwaukee County government would have to meet. Turning to the zoo, where we're standing here today. The zoo has experienced some issues on both the operating and the capital side. The zoo has set some very ambitious attendance goals. Attendance at the zoo is driven in part by weather, which the zoo obviously cannot control. Failure to meet these goals has caused mid-year deficits virtually in every year for the past several years. The zoo is expecting another deficit this year. Again, that's not a reflection of poor management or anything like that. It's a reflection of a lot of different things. To their credit, what zoo officials typically do is, because they're unsure of attendance until late in the year, they often put off spending money that has been allocated for basic repairs and maintenance. And then if it turns out that indeed there's a revenue problem, then oftentimes they're unable to do that basic repair and maintenance work. So there's a pretty substantial deferred maintenance backlog for the zoo on the operating side. On the capital side, the zoo is currently in the midst of a new master planning process that is likely to result in a recommendation for about $80 million worth of projects for the zoo. And several of those projects are tied to the zoo's operating condition. The feeling is that unless the zoo refreshes certain exhibits, continually gives its patrons a reason to visit the zoo, that they're going to have trouble meeting these revenue targets, and they're going to have trouble on the operating side. So that's a very big number. The model that the county and the Zoological Society has used in the past is that the master plan projects get funded 50-50. That hasn't been fully worked out yet. But coming up with half of $80 million would be certainly a major challenge for Milwaukee County government. In the meantime, there's been $5 million of just basic nuts and bolt capital repairs that have been identified that is also going to have to come into play here. Finally, the Milwaukee County Parks Department. I'm not doing this justice, obviously, with one slide. We've heard a lot about staffing issues in the Milwaukee County parks. We dug into it and were able to retrieve some data from the Parks Department that looked at the staffing issue a little different way. We looked at their their staffing levels during their peak season in the summer, and can confirm that indeed staffing reductions have occurred over the last 5 years. There is a maintenance backlog that those staffing reductions have contributed to. And just as a place setter, returning staffing to 2008 levels would cost about $3 million. On the capital side, again, you're seeing a very big number here, $82.5 million in capital needs over the next 5 years, and that's $25 million more than was actually spent on parks capital over the previous 5 years. This has been talked about a lot in the media. We certainly did not go out and do a rigorous evaluation of parks buildings and structures, but we would attest that this is a major source of need. Interestingly, the vast majority of capital needs for the parks are related to basic repairs and replacement. Dozens upon dozens of HVAC and roof and facade and similar type work that needs to be done, as opposed to some of the other institutions which really have a need for one big project that's going to boost their earned revenue potential, but perhaps not as many smaller needs. So what does all of this tell us about the county-owned institutions? First of all, one of our observations is sort of the under-the-radar nature of the county's debt service support for these institutions. The county does not include debt service in the budgets of each of these entities. So debt service is budgeted in one central place in the county budget. And many people who work for Milwaukee County, many elected officials at Milwaukee County really are unaware of how much money is specifically being devoted to debt service for the different county functions. What we are seeing on this slide is that, first of all, debt service for the parks and cultural institutions is about 35% of the overall county debt service payment in 2012. When you consider all of the county's buildings and structures, that's a high percentage. And that the county is actually spending about 75% of what it is spending on operations, on operating support for these entities to service debt on capital repair projects. So those are, again, two big issues, and there's been really not a lot of attention to the fact that, that combined, there's this $21 million or so of debt service being paid annually for these entities. What does that say to us? It says that enhancing the capital program at the county level is going to be problematic. The county is facing some local revenue challenges and is already putting $21 million into debt service, and so that's certainly going to be a challenge. A few other observations as we look at the question of dedicated funding for capital versus operations, if that's the direction that this community would want to go. We've observed, and I think I've hinted at the fact, that the county-owned entities have done a pretty good job being able to offset flat or reduced county operating support. They've come up with innovative ways to boost earned revenues. They've come up with private support to support their operations. They've been able to reduce costs in various manners. And so do we want to change that? If we were to give more on the operating side, would that in any way diminish the motivation and the wherewithal of these entities to come up with similar innovation? And I can't answer that question for you. But what I can tell you is that it is difficult to innovate your way out of capital needs. If your roof is leaking, you got to fix that roof. And so I think that's a distinction that we look at. When we try to look at the question objectively, how could you sort of make a decision as to whether capital is more important than operating, I think this is a factor that needs to be kept in mind. Another factor that needs to be kept in mind is that it is indeed difficult for the county-owned institutions to raise private dollars to support their basic infrastructure needs. You're not going to put somebody's name on a repair of a leaky roof or a new HVAC system. And these are the types of projects that are more difficult to attract private sector support. Furthermore, I think there's a feeling among private sector donors that these are county-owned buildings, and so it is the county's responsibility to do the basic repair and upkeep, though several of these institutions, the Marcus Center and the Public Museum among them, have been successful in raising private contributions for bigger ticket projects. Finally, and we offer this as just an insight, if indeed this is the conversation we're going to have, there's a compelling case to be made that one of the things that public support for capital does is it guarantees public access to these public buildings. Conversely, when we start to talk about doing more from the public to support operations, we inevitably get into a conversation about the salaries and benefits of the individuals who run and work for these organizations. And I'm not saying that's a fair argument to make, but that's, again, it's a factor that comes into that conversation that doesn't come into the conversation if we were talking about the capital side. So that's a recap on the county side. I'm going to go very quickly through some of the privately owned institutions. We looked at 6 of them. Why examine privately owned institutions? We have found in our research that in other metro regions, public funding sources have been used to support both public and private. It's complicated here. We have a very successful United Performing Arts Fund that raises more than $10 million per year to support our performing arts organizations. So if we were to consider possibly doing something more on the public side, what does that do to UPAF? Does that mean UPAF goes away? Does that make it harder for UPAF to raise $10 million? Or conversely, does that make it easier for UPAF to be viable and even more successful because its donors are seeing that other needs are being taken care of in some other way and they could perhaps be more focused? We don't know the answer to that question, but as you move forward, we think that's an issue that you ought to contemplate. There already is some limited public support for some of the private institutions. It's very limited, about $350,000 or so in CAMPAC, which is a county-funded fund that's distributed widely among a variety of different arts organizations. And the City of Milwaukee has a Milwaukee Arts Board that distributes about $150,000. Again, we felt it was worth looking at. We didn't have the capacity to look at the whole list, so we decided to hone in on 6 that we hope are broadly representative. So the first of those 6 is Discovery World. You look at Discovery World and you say to yourself, boy, it helps to have a new building. They don't have the general nuts and bolts infrastructure needs that so many of these other institutions do. Their operating budget, while they experienced some substantial problems in 2008, they've been able to work their way out of those. They don't have the pressures in their operating budget of having to devote lots and lots of resources to general minor repairs and maintenance. However, they're still concerned. Their earned revenue has been stagnant. They don't have the reserves they'd like to have, and the volatility of private funding creates some challenges. On the capital side, as I said, much more manageable than the other institutions we looked at because they are newer, also because they've enjoyed some strong private sector support and they have low debt levels. We looked at the Milwaukee Ballet, a world-renowned ballet, not only for its performances, but also for its ballet school. The ballet experienced some substantial problems on the operating side several years ago. That outlook has vastly improved. One of their concerns is that they are extremely reliant on UPAF, and they too have a lack of reserves that makes it a little more difficult for them to withstand annual cyclical revenue volatility with ticket sales and so on. But perhaps a bigger problem for the ballet is the deteriorating physical state of the Jody Peck Center, which is their headquarters, their main building. Their school is so successful they could really use some enhanced capacity. So they have come up with what is called the Harmony Initiative, a potential $40 million project, which not only would address some of these problems, but in terms of when you look at their operating budget stability, they see as a way to ensure. And again, a key overriding theme. We do a lot of talking about capital versus operating, but in so many examples, the ability of an organization to make a major capital improvement is directly tied to its ability to secure sustainability in terms of the operating budget going forward. So there is and can be a tie-in there. We looked at the Milwaukee Repertory Theater. Depths of the recession, like all of us, they experienced some issues. situation has improved, but still some relatively minor concerns on the operating side. On the capital side, the rep has an aging building. They have a big capital problem in terms of some foundation repairs, and those needs are going to grow. So that is their foremost concern. The Symphony, I'm not going to go into detail on the Symphony. I'm sure you've all read in the newspaper recently about some of the challenges facing the Symphony. In a nutshell, increased pension costs, an over-reliance on private support, declining ticket sales have created a rather large structural imbalance. A new plan has just been announced. Clearly, obviously too early for us or anyone else to tell whether that plan is going to be successful, but a very serious situation there. We do cite in our report that plans for a new symphony hall have been mentioned over the past several years. That project, I think, without question, is on hold pending the outcome of the new plan to get the operating budget under control. We simply mention it in the report to say that it's something that potentially could rematerialize. And again, it could come to be that a new symphony hall is going to be considered a must-have in terms of the ability of the symphony to generate the earned revenues that it needs to meet its needs. So again, in the numbers, when you see the numbers grouped up in our report, we are not including a new symphony hall, which could cost in the range of $84 to $90 million, but we note it as something that could potentially happen after this 5-year time frame that really was the focus of our analysis. We looked at the Milwaukee Youth Arts Center, which is a very interesting model. It's a center that essentially has two main patrons, First Stage Theater and the Milwaukee Youth Symphony Orchestra. It has a stable operating condition because those two organizations are doing well. Ironically, doing so well that they already, this center was built and opened early in the last decade, but they are already contemplating a new expansion that could further boost their earned revenue potential that would cost about $15 million. Finally, the Skylight Music Theater, operating deficits in 4 of the last 5 years, some real concerns there about basic maintenance needs and about the volatility of their earned revenue streams. There too, one of the two buildings, an older building, a substantial need for repairs at that building, and they are one of the entities that really cited that private fundraising is very difficult for these basic building repair needs. So what does all of this tell us as we look to compare the state of the privately owned to the publicly owned? First of all, again, this is intuitive. Given that these entities are not supported with very much public support, they're more reliant on earned revenue, they're more reliant on private donations, and thus they're more susceptible to swings in the local economy. So the good news about public sector support is that it tends to be somewhat stable. That obviously hasn't happened over the past several years with Milwaukee County because of its challenges. But while it remains flat, it's good because it remains flat. So the economy dips, and typically if you have a major component of public funding, you can sort of rely on that. In the case of the privately owned, when the economy is not doing well, they're likely to see a drop in both ticket sales and private donations, and so it can cause some pretty radical one-year swings. That being said, overall, if that's their biggest problem, I think most of the county institutions would certainly trade for that. With the exception of the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, the operating challenges of the private entities we find are less severe than the publicly owned. And again, their big issues are they could use better reserves to get them through those fluctuations in the cyclical downturns of the economy, and to take care of their growing maintenance needs. And so that's certainly a set of needs, but I think it pales in comparison to some of the needs that we see for some of the county-owned. Where there's commonality, again, is this basic infrastructure question, the difficulty that both sets of entities face in terms of generating private support for some of these nuts and bolts infrastructure repairs that, if they don't take place, they obviously impact the business model and the operations budget. I'm going to conclude with just a very brief overview of the major sports and convention facilities. We did an even more cursory look at the finances of these institutions. We thought it would be instructive, however. We thought that there's not a lot of understanding out there about the business models for the Bradley Center and Miller Park and the Wisconsin Center, why there are revenue challenge and operating budget challenges there, what are the capital needs. So we have about 5 pages on each of these in the report. Why examine sports and convention? Milwaukee is not alone. In 2 of the 5 other metros that we are looking at, that we'll be discussing in our next report, the dedicated funding source that was put in place to support arts and cultural institutions also supports sports and/or convention cities. That's Oklahoma City and in Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh. So there is some precedent for doing this. We're no dummies. We knew that this linkage was already being discussed, and we thought that we didn't want to do an asset analysis without including some information on these major institutions. And we believe that, again, better public understanding can help inform this discussion. So we didn't have the capacity to look at them all, but we decided to look at the biggest 3. So our take on the BMO Harris Bradley Center. You know, we looked at their operating situation. We can, you know, attest to the fact and confirm that were it not for 2 $5 million grants from the state of Wisconsin, the BMO Harris Bradley Center would have run operating deficits in each of the past several years. It's sort of ironic because then you look, well, what are they doing now, and how are they able to get by for the next few years? 2017, as you know, is the big date because that's when the lease with the Milwaukee Bucks expires. And you see the commitment from the business community to supplement Bradley Center revenues with some contributions, the naming rights deal with BMO Harris. There's now a contribution in the 2014 budget from the city of Milwaukee. So you sort of see the Bradley Center starting to look like many of these other entities. What are these other entities doing? Because their earned revenues tend to be volatile. They're looking to buttress that with private sector donations. They're trying to get some public funding to the extent they can. And so when you think about it, the strategy that the Bradley Center is undertaking to try to move forward, at least for the next few years, is not dissimilar. Where there's a big difference, however, is what happens after 2017. Because, again, we asked the question in the report. There's nothing to say that we couldn't try to continue to make that model work. The issue is, if the Bucks leave, then what? And you know, our analysis shows again that the Bucks do supply more than 50% of the ticket sale revenue at the Bradley Center is attributed to the Bucks. While revenue is shared, a great deal of it with the team, without question, having the Bucks at the BMO Harris Bradley Center is very important to the organization's bottom line. And so, if you lose the Bucks, are you also able to shed costs associated with having the Bucks in that facility? That's a big question. But what we see is that these same deferred maintenance needs, they exist whether the Bucks are there or not. So to still have the BMO Harris Bradley Center exist for the Admirals and for Marquette basketball and for major concerts, you're still going to have these expenditure pressures, yet you're losing a good chunk of your earned revenue potential. So does that mean that a new arena or a renovated arena has to happen? It doesn't. But what it does suggest is that we all ought to be thinking about, could the BMO Harris Bradley Center survive without the Bucks? And if it can't, then what are we going to do about that? And so again, that's a question. We don't have an answer to that question. We looked at Miller Park. We were just interested in sort of scanning the financial situation there. One of the questions that has been out there is that even if the sales tax goes away in approximately 2018, which is the current estimate, what would happen in terms of repair and maintenance needs going further, and there is a strategy in place to deal with that. So again, this is sort of food for thought in terms of the other entities that we look at. We looked at the Wisconsin Center, and clearly there were some severe problems at the Wisconsin Center a few years ago during the depths of the recession. The food and beverage tax was increased. That has addressed the problem for now. Going forward, still some operational concerns. Here, too, we can't tell you the definitive answer, but we can certainly raise the question, which is whether, indeed, operating stability for the Wisconsin Center is tied to the need that it has detailed to expand the convention center to be able to better compete for national conventions. And that's a big cost as well. So I'm going to summarize now. I hope I haven't gone on too long, Ann. I'm starting to. But I will summarize now what we said. So key findings. First of all, 5-year capital needs are immense. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Again, the wild card is we can tell you what the perceived need is based on our research. We don't know the extent to which private sector sources can support that need versus public sector sources. Operating needs are generally less acute than capital needs. That's not necessarily the case as much for the parks and the zoo, but for the other county-owned facilities, because of these two new agreements, that's the case. For the privately owned entities, again, biggest concerns there are reserves and ability to address basic maintenance repairs, but 5 of the 6 in sound fiscal health. Private fundraising, that's a question mark. There are some big projects on the horizon. The question is, and they've been very successful in raising from a very generous philanthropic community funds to take care of this in the past. Is that going to be doable in the future? Other key findings, I have really not talked about it here. There's a lot more attention given in the report, but again, we make a distinction as we are laying out the needs between basic repairs and replacement and capital improvements. And I think that's going to be very important for you, because as you start to think about funding models, there are certain funding models that may lend themselves best to taking care of some of a relatively small list of major projects, whereas there are other funding models that might be more appropriate to sort of provide an ongoing steady stream of support for basic repair and maintenance. Does that mean a hybrid can't be developed? It doesn't. But if you choose one of those courses, you might take care of a set of needs for one group of institutions, but you wouldn't necessarily take care of a set of needs for another. And finally, as I mentioned, with regard to the BMO Harris Bradley Center and the Wisconsin Center, their long-term stability may be tied to these major investments. And the question is, if we, what would happen if we don't make these major investments? We at least need to start contemplating. My 20-second soundbite for my 164-page. Indeed, Milwaukee County's public and private arts, cultural, recreational, and entertainment facilities have substantial facility needs. Whether those needs and challenges rise above those facing other important community assets, we can't tell you. We think it's a legitimate question to have on the table. The Public Policy Forum has done a great deal of research into the capital needs of city government and county government and the sewerage district. And we have a general set, and MPS, and we have a general set of infrastructure challenges in this community. I think one of the tasks for all of us is to figure out, do we need to set priorities, and if so, where are those priorities going to be? However, if indeed we are interested in keeping what we have for a variety of reasons, then our research points to the fact that there will need to be an increased funding commitment from either the public or private sector, or most likely both. So I apologize again if I went on too long, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Rob. If you stay up here for a minute, we'll just So what we'd like to do is spend the rest of our time in kind of a Q&A format. The first part of it would be questions you might have for Rob on the report. And the second part would be us having a greater understanding of your expectations of what we'd like to accomplish as this task force. So I'd like to start out with you folks being able to ask Rob questions. I would state that the questions are limited to people on the task force. And as this event is being streamed, we need you to speak into the microphone, so they'll try to run around and get you a microphone, and then it would be included in the online presentation that's taking place right now. So questions for Rob? So they've all read 148 pages. It's
Rob, let's assume for the sake of our discussion that we need sales tax augmentation to globally address the capital needs and the operating needs of those assets that have contributed to the great quality of life in Milwaukee and which attract people who want to live here and work here and businesses to support them. How do you propose, if you have any proposal at all, that the revenue stream from such a tax be divided up between all of the various and sundry entities that your group has identified as having both a combination of capital and operating needs?
It's a great question, and you're not going to get a direct answer, because we're not going to propose an approach. We will, however, Frank, in our second report, I think you'll get great insight in terms of looking at how these 5 other places dealt with that question. So there's a model in Allegheny County where there's a 1-cent sales tax. Half of that goes for property tax relief. The other half goes to generally support a set of community assets. There's a set percentage of that remaining half-cent sales tax that is distributed among 9 key institutions in greater Pittsburgh. There's another set that is specifically reserved for paying off debt associated with the new stadium for the Steelers, the new stadium for the Pirates, and an expanded convention center. And then there's a third tier of funds that are available under a competitive grants process for everybody else. Now, I can't tell you what everybody else means, but they've defined what arts and cultural and entertainment organizations can then apply for those funds, and they have set up a mechanism where there's an independent board that makes those decisions every year. So that might be one approach to use. St. Louis, which is another place we'll look at, they just focus on the 5 key county-owned institutions, and they use a property tax to do that. So that's sort of the opposite approach. So we'll give you 5 different types, and I'm hoping it'll be informative to you as you grapple with that question.
Gary?
Jay, if I can make a couple of comments. I'm Gary Grunow. I'm chair of the Spirit Board, and there are some other people here from the Spirit today: Julia Taylor, Frank Gimbel, and Paul Matthews. We are an organization that's been in existence for over 25 years. We were founded by Charlie McNear of Wisconsin Energy. Our purpose is to make Milwaukee a better place to live, work, play, and to visit. Some of our funds, all of our funds for the last 7 or 8 or 10 years have come from the naming rights on the convention center. We were able to hang on to some of those. The vast majority supported both our convention bureau visit and also the center. But there were some residual funds that we've used in the last 4 years. We created the Milwaukee Mark. We were actually the seed money for Radio Milwaukee, the seed money for the Water Council, the seed money also for the bike sharing program you're going to see next summer. But last summer, our board sat down and said, what can we do that's going to be truly helpful to the community? And we decided to contract with the Public Policy Forum to start this study. So the study actually predated this committee, and it worked out very well, I think. And we are so pleased with the report that Rob and his people have put together. It's an immense report. It's 165 pages, and no one's ever tried to tie all the needs of the community down in his respective areas. So we thanked him at his trustees meeting yesterday, and I thank you again publicly, Rob, to you and your staff. As we go forward, as Rob reported, there's going to be a subsequent type report coming out in February or early March that shows these models. We're also funding that. And as we go forward from there, I'm sure that those 4 models aren't going to fit us exactly. That this is a tool that this group can use all during this next year. That what happens if we do this? What if we mix this in? What do we do that? So we have a big job. We hope to be able to provide the data that will support some of the decisions here. And we also are right now looking at creating an interactive site, a website, where the general public and people outside of the table here will be able to get in to the report, to pull different parts out on the revenue, to mix and match what are the needs, what should we be looking at, which cultural assets, is it capital, new capital for renovation, is it operating expenses, et cetera. So we're going to try to broaden the whole story to the whole community. When we started out, we wanted to look at the community needs, and that's why it's broad all the way across the table, cultural, county-owned, private, and also the sports entertainment. I'd also like to point out, though, it has been confined only to Milwaukee County on purpose. We didn't want to get out and cause something that was a little bit controversial. As you can see, there's enough controversy about that in every paper you pick up right now. But I'd point out to some of our good people that are here today from these other counties that the needs you saw today are the same type you must have in your county. And I just ask you to keep an open mind as we go forward, because some of the information that is going to be reported in subsequent reports is going to show what the effect could be with input from some of the surrounding counties. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jennifer. Jennifer, you get the award for the best T-shirt.
Thank you.
Nice.
My name is Jennifer O'Hare, and I'm a Milwaukee public school parent. I'm also here today as a volunteer leader with Common Ground. I wanted to thank Mr. Henkin and the Public Policy Forum for their great work. However, as well researched and thorough as the report is, we find that it's incomplete. Many of the institutions that are in the report are institutions that personally, for me and my family, are beloved institutions that we patronize and support. but honestly, they're places that kids in Milwaukee County go to maybe once or twice a year. I think of them as field trip destinations. I hope that we can broaden the scope of our discussion here to include the places beyond the field trip destinations, to include the places our kids play every single day. The public school playgrounds and athletic facilities. We have done our own research at Common Ground and issued our own report showing that in these public school playgrounds in Milwaukee County and the public athletic facilities, we need at least $150 million to $250 million to upgrade those facilities for our kids. So if we are going to sit together around this table and discuss how we might give the Bucks a great new place to play, I hope that we can include in that discussion how we can also give all the children of Milwaukee County a great place to play every day. Thank you, and we look forward to working with you.
Go ahead.
If we're on the section to talk about caution and our
Well, what
hopes,
I think I
or-
want to say focus on first is questions people would have for Rob's report. So if we could stay focused for a minute or two on that. Larry?
Mine is simple and a little bit forward-looking, perhaps. Indianapolis was not included among the cities examined.
We did not include, we started off with a list of about a dozen, and we narrowed down on these 5 because we thought that their funding models, given what we knew about our needs, might be most relevant. So I can't recall why. I know Indy was originally looked at, but it may also have been that their model was so similar to another one we're looking at that we just didn't include them.
Rob,
Yes.
does this
John?
report, or are there other reports that talk about the economic impact of these institutions?
This report does not. That does by no means suggest that that's not a very important question, however, John. And you know, that probably would have been a one-year research project on its own, but no, we did not.
Okay, Suzanne?
Rob, Suzanne Kelly with the Waukesha County Business Alliance. Does the report look at, or do you have information on the number of customers each of these institutions serves annually and where they come from?
This report does not, but Part 2 will. So we are compiling that information because we think it is very germane to the consideration of the funding model and the funding sources.
Okay, if I could ask also, as this is being online, if you just introduce yourself when you make your comments so that the public can understand who's speaking.
Julia Taylor, Greater Milwaukee Committee. Rob, in the report you referenced the fact that some of the capital investment will actually create more earned income opportunities. Do you have a sense about how impactful that would be or how important it is to those institutions?
Julia, I think you almost have to look at it institution by institution. The one that leaps out for me is the zoo. There you see this very firm direct connection between some of these capital investments and their ability to, again, meet their attendance targets and make their business model work. You arguably see that with the BMO Harris Bradley Center as well. So you have to go institution by institution, but we do that in the report. I think it divides up pretty clearly. For the county-owned, we know that the parks, for example, are on the side of needing lots of different smaller infrastructure repairs. We look at the Marcus Center, and we look at the zoo, and that's where it's more the big projects that are tied to earn revenue potential.
Yes, Ellen, if you could.
Ellen Gilligan, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Is there, in your study, any state revenue, or is there any state revenue in any of these other models that you've looked at?
It's a good question. I can't tell you the answer because we're not done with the research for the second report. I think that in terms of dedicated funding streams, we have not seen one where there's state revenue. Now, there's other forms of state support that's going in to support various institutions in some other places. In terms of here, as I said, the one clear example is the BMO Harris Bradley Center. I think some people aren't aware that the Bradley Center Corporation is an instrumentality of the state of Wisconsin. It was created by the state. So essentially, the building is owned by the state of Wisconsin, and the state has indeed provided about $10 million worth of grants to take care of some infrastructure needs over the past several years. There's a small state arts fund, and so a variety of the facilities of the organizations get small amounts of money from the state, but there's not, other than that, sizable state dollars involved here.
Okay. One more question if we'd like for Rob, if someone has one. If not, we'll move on to the next phase of discussion. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it. So I think right now we'd like to move into a conversation for about 15 minutes, and recognizing the size of the group, we probably would not be able to hear from everyone. But we'd like to have a little bit of time on your thoughts about the hopes, the expectations, if you want to say the stumbling blocks, the caution you would have as we move forward with this task force. So this is a time where you can kind of let us know what you're thinking about as we take steps forward here. Let's see, microphones, please. Just be a...
Thanks, Jay. So,
If you'd introduce yourself for...
Debbie Seeger from Patina Solutions. Many of you know Mitchell Fromstein, who passed away recently as the former chairman of Manpower, one of the global employers. And I had the opportunity to work for Manpower and Mitchell for 13 years. And a lot of people know he was a workforce strategist and a visionary. What a lot of people may not know is that there was one simple formula that he kept in mind, and that it still takes 21 years to make a 21-year-old. What that means is that we can't do any of this thinking about the future costs of our community events, services, facilities without, in tandem, recognizing that we have a severe shortage and deficit of taxpayers coming behind us as baby boomers. There are 78 million baby boomers. There are 48 million Gen Xers. And there are 10,000 people that turn 65 every day. Starting last January, 10,000 every day for the next 20 years. And if some of you have never heard that before, let this be the day that you first heard and recognized the importance and the impact of that fact and what it means to who's going to be paying for the things that we develop financing for. How are we going to behave around considering the future 20 years and what this community will look like 20 years from now when we're leaving potential debt or making decisions about that debt for those 30 million fewer folks who are going to be in the community to pay for it. And if we are at the peak of our tax base with the group of baby boomers we have right now, 78 million of them, and we're in this much financial trouble, holy you know what. And so I think it just makes sense for us to consider if this is going to be a group effort around being creative to consider what Gen Xers are going to think is important for them to have to fund and live and work and play with in their community when they're the ones who will also be impacted by the decisions we make. And that we just consider that in tandem as we go through the creative situations and financial modeling that we consider here. Because that won't change, that formula, that it takes 21 years to make a 21-year-old. And so we are left with the demographics of a tax base that we have. It would make some sense to me and that we look at that demographic view in Milwaukee County so we know exactly what we're talking about in terms of a tax base today, 5 years from now, 10, 15, and 20 years from now. And that mirrored against the long-term view of what we're going to have to raise money for would be responsible.
Thank you. You can just hand it right to Rich.
Thanks. Rich Tennyson with the Zoological Society of Milwaukee. It's my hope as we embark on this that we look big picture and look at what can be, maybe not where we've been, and think big about where we want to play as a global player in the global economy going forward and how much different things will be in 20, 30 years from now, and what's going to be important to everybody. And that we look at different ways that people have solved these issues, and that if we look at regional destination attractions, venues that are important to us as a region, that we look at a regional approach to solve those. And the fear would be that we try to load too much onto that may be local concerns that may make it suffer under its own weight. So those would be the areas my hope and also concerns.
Thank you. Thanks, Deanna.
Hi, Jay. Deanna Taylor, United Performing Arts Fund. Just sort of piggybacking on what Debbie had to say, I think that it's important to also recognize with demographics that there are a number of trends that are evolving with how people individually donate. So in terms of private funding, you have the demographic issues clearly, but you also have, we can tell in the philanthropic world that people give differently. They do it through different channels, but they also have a different mindset. We also, in addition to that, have private foundations that are sunsetting, and there is going to be a relatively large deficit when you look at 2020 on some of the foundations that will no longer be here, or they will be minimized significantly. So we do need to take into consideration not only on the public sector side, but also in terms of private funding, where are those dollars going to come from, and what are those trends that are changing that we need to monitor and somehow project what the implications are going to be.
Thank you. Gary?
Yes, Jay, if I can make one more comment, then I'll be quiet. No, I won't. To Tim's comments before, okay, in the first place, in any model you see, you don't see these taxes going on forever. And I think we'll evolve into this thing. It'd have to be sunsetted. What do if it's a sales tax? It's going to be 5 years, 10 years, and it's done. It's a specific list of projects. That's the things that other areas of the country have accepted. So it's not a 20 or 30-year load on our citizens, number one. Number two, though, if we don't do anything, we're going to slide backwards. In the next 30 years, there's going to be 60 million more people in the United States than there are today. 60 million. 90% of those people are going to live in cities. They're going to be births, there's going to be immigrants, and everything else like that. Our city has been very stable in our county in our total population. We don't want to be Detroit. We don't want to be St. Louis, where the people living really went down as the cities decayed. And the only way you can do that is to invest in your infrastructure and the needs you need. I used to say, I don't want this city to be another Des Moines. Well, I'll tell you, Des Moines is going by us right now because they have a heck of a program going on as an area down there. So I guess we can start comparing ourselves to Fargo or someplace, but they've got oil. So, we need to do something. And doing nothing is absolutely a zero alternative in my mind right now.
Okay. Mike, you want to? Okay. Ellen?
I just wanted to ask a process question, and that is if there is a process for the public to weigh in to some of these questions. Is there a website that they can put questions on? Is there a way
Yes.
to get public input?
I would just say yes, that process is being put in place, and we're going to make sure, one, with this group, we have time to have smaller group visits between now and the next meeting. We want to make sure we have access points that people on this committee can send in their views if they hadn't had an opportunity at this meeting, and that the public itself could communicate to the task force to share what their views would be.
I just want to add, just for starters, at this meeting, we passed out the same, at this meeting, we passed out the same feedback form to the audience that we gave to the task force members because we knew there wouldn't be enough time, probably even for all the task force members to comment who might like to. But the members of the audience who are here today who would like to register an idea, a concern, a question, a suggestion,
can do so on the forms that they have, and those will be added to the record of this meeting, so that they will become public as well. We also have set up a website, and I just sent an email to, because I'm not positive about the URL for that, but we'll make that known as well. The two key things that I was told were principles of this task force were transparency and inclusiveness. So we're open to thinking about all the ways that we can make those two things happen.
Thank you. Oh, right over there, Rocky.
Thank you. Rocky Marcoux, Commissioner of the Department of City Development for the City of Milwaukee. I think a couple pieces that have already been put on the table, but essentially I think we need to concentrate on that. Tim used the term generational in his remarks, and I think that's very important. We also had some remarks about where we are from a demographic standpoint. Gary's remarks to where we are from a stability standpoint cannot be actually overstated. We may be the only northern tier industrial city that's actually stabilized its population and is growing. There's 22,000 people that are living in downtown Milwaukee right now, compared to a fraction of that literally 10 to 15 years ago. The urban environment is where people are gravitating towards. It's where human beings always have. Kind of the suburban blip that occurred, okay, in the history of where we are as human beings is more of an aberration caused by a lot of confluences of things, the end of World War II, the suburbanization of the transportation system, things along those lines. And that's not a cut on the suburbs. The point being that cities are where people gravitate to. And we're seeing it as the urban center of the region. Milwaukee continues to attract very large numbers of younger professionals. And it's true, you can't create a 21-year-old, but you can certainly entice a 21-year-old to move to this city, and that's what's happening. And we cycle through our great educational institutions thousands of young men and women on a 4-year basis, many more of whom are now choosing to say Milwaukee is my home, Milwaukee is where I want to put down my roots, where I want to start my family, where I want to start my business, where I want to be successful. So I think what we have to keep in mind as this group, we've been given, quite frankly, a great privilege to stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us that created all of these institutions, both the public decisions and the private decisions, and figure out how do we move this forward for the next generation in a fiscally responsible way, but also in a way that continues to make Milwaukee a destination for people who want to have a city that has a quality of life that we believe is second to none. And I ultimately look at that as our shared responsibility for why we're here.
Okay, good. Mary?
Hi, I'm Mary McCormick from the Rotary Club of Milwaukee, and I just wanted to comment that I think the MMAC and Tim do a fabulous job of really talking about the region of southeastern Wisconsin, but not a lot of people do that. And we've been having conversations about how to act and how to think as a region for decades, and we haven't yet figured out how to do that. And I think that we have an opportunity here to make another attempt at that. I think that insofar as Rob can help us look at other models where other areas have come together as a region. But I mean, southeastern Wisconsin is a very important and dynamic region, and we all want to be part of the growth. And so how do we learn to act like a region and not a city and suburbs?
Good. Okay, get it to Mike.
I'm Michael Burkham, president of Milwaukee Area Technical College, and let me start by saying I'm not a Wisconsinite, and I want to apologize for that. Secondly, I moved to Milwaukee several years ago from the Bay Area of California in January, so you'll probably question my judgment about that as well. But the first organization I joined when I moved here, I think the first weekend I was here, I joined the Milwaukee Art Museum. A couple weeks later, I went to the Milwaukee Symphony Orchestra, and to use Tim's term, it punches above its weight class. I spent a good deal of time in Dallas, Texas. My first reaction was the symphony exceeds what I experienced in Dallas. You folks live here all your lives. You may not sense that punching above your weight class syndrome, but it had a profound effect on me. I thought, we don't deserve a symphony this good. It was my first reaction, no offense, but it was an extraordinary experience. And I'm sitting here feeling a real sense of urgency about this, and I just hope everybody else understands what's at risk and how urgent this conversation, the pace of this conversation needs to be, because there's I think the fate of this community, it could very easily be a generational mistake if we miss this opportunity.
Good, thank you. So we're going to take one more question. If not, maybe we've had all the questions. John, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you for your participation. One more thing, we do have the URL code. It's culturalneedstaskforce.com, and cultural needs with an S, task force is one word. That would be the URL address.
Well, thanks, Jay, and thanks, Chuck, and most importantly, thank all of you. We all know that nothing happens without leadership, and we have a tremendously talented group of people here on the task force, which tells me that if we put our minds together, we can do for the next generation what others have done for this community. The pace in the globe in which we now operate is different. Things that took 20 years to formulate and make happen years ago now happen, you know, in 1/10 of that time. And it is a very competitive environment in which we all operate. We've got some very wonderful assets in our community. We have tremendous leadership here on this task force, which will give us the ability to create options that we can all think through in terms of how we want this community to look for the next several decades. So we look forward to all of us working together, sharing ideas, exchanging information, and coming up with really solutions for Milwaukee. The next task force meeting is going to be February 4th. Look forward to working with all of you. We certainly look forward to involving everyone in the public in this community, because we know that the entire community has to be involved for the very best solutions. So wish everybody a great holiday and look forward to working with you as we go forward. Thank you very much.